Welcome to Read Ancient Languages. I'm Dr. Fausto Labruto. Today we will discuss two Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew, I'm sure you are familiar with it. It's one of the synoptic Gospels of the canon of the New Testament. And the Gospel of Thomas, which is an Apocryphal Gospel and therefore is not included in the canon of the New Testament. During the presentation, I will tell you a little about the history of the Gospel of Thomas. We will discuss a little bit of Coptic, which is an ancient language of Egypt, and a little bit of ancient Greek. Then we will discuss the origin of the Gospels and similarities and differences between Thomas and Matthew. So first of all, a little bit of history. What you see here are 2 pages of the only existent copy of the Gospel of Thomas. It is a manuscript written on papyrus. It's written in a language called Coptic, which is an ancient language from Egypt. It's considered the last evolutionary stage of ancient Egyptian. There were several dialects of Coptic. This particular manuscript is written in a variant of the dialect called Sahidic, and it was accidentally found at a location called Nag Hammadi, buried underground in 1945. It was written probably in the 3rd century, so it had been lying underground for probably 16 centuries. Now, until this manuscript was found in 1945, scholars had no concrete evidence that the Gospel of Thomas existed at all. There were some diffuse references to the Gospel of Thomas in the writings of the Church Fathers in the first centuries of the history of the Catholic Church, but there was no complete copy available. Once this manuscript was found and translated, the scholars realized that some small fragments of it had been in fact found years earlier by archaeologists at a totally different location in Egypt, a place called Oxyrhynchos. The smaller fragments in ancient Greek that were found correspond very well to this version in Coptic. But this is, like I say, the only complete version of the Gospel of Thomas. It's in a perfect state of preservation, and it is easy to read for the Coptic student. And for those of you who do not speak Coptic, there are plenty of translations available online. So because this Gospel did not make it to the New Testament, it's considered an apocryphal. But more than that, this Gospel was actually considered heretic. That means that it was outlawed, and that could be one of the reasons why it was hidden underground for such a long time. The Gospel of Thomas is considered reference literature for a group of Christians who followed the current of thought called the Gnosticism. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the theology behind the heresy called Gnosticism, but it must be said that still today this gospel is considered very controversial for its contents. It has been the subject of speculations, of fiction, of urban legends and whatnot. But today I would like to look at the philological aspects of this manuscript and how it can help us in tracing the history of the origin of the Gospels. Right, now, so the main difference in contents between the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels of the New Testament is that the canonical Gospel have a narrative that include a narration of the acts of Jesus as well as of his sayings, whereas the Gospel of Thomas only includes the sayings. So there is no storyline about what Jesus or his apostles did, but the Gospel of Thomas is a succession of sayings, largely by Jesus and in some cases by his apostles, 114 of his sayings in succession. The Gospel of Thomas does not have any reference or narration or story about the birth or youth of Jesus. It does not have any narration about his passion and death or even resurrection. There is no mention of the cross or of the Last Supper in the Gospel of Thomas. However, in this succession of sayings by Jesus, there are some interesting similarities in the sayings which we find in the canonic Gospels, in particular in Matthew. And today I would like to take just one little example and go through it to prove this point. So I have selected a small passage of the Gospel of Thomas, which we will now translate and compare with Matthew. So this is the passage I have selected, is the saying number 16. So let's read it, starting from the last word of the first line. It goes like this. Tacha eumeo jirome je entaiei enuje nuerene ep cosmos. Ause soun an je entaiei anuje en hen porex egen pekach u kocht u sefe u polemos. So what does this mean? Here is a translation. This is Jesus talking and saying, maybe they think that I have come to cast peace upon the world, and they don't know that I have come to cast divisions upon earth, a fire, a sword, a war. Now, if you are familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, you may have noticed a similarity with an interesting passage in the 10th chapter. This is Matthew 10:43. I've chosen the oldest copy of this Gospel available, the Codex Vaticanus. Let's read it together, starting from the last word of first line. It goes like this. Me nomiste oti elton balein erenen epitengen, uk elton balein erenen, alla makairan. And the translation is, don't think that I've come to cast peace upon earth. I have not come to cast peace, but a sword. This is obviously Jesus talking. So, comparison of these two passages, one in the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic, and one in the Gospel of Matthew in ancient Greek, immediately shows a similarity. There are many other similar sayings between the two Gospels. I've only chosen this as a small example to prove a point. Interestingly, the majority of sayings which are comparable between Thomas and Matthew are to be found in chapter 10 of Matthew. Now, chapter 10 of Matthew is an interesting chapter. First of all, is mainly a chapter composed of sayings. There is very little action about what Jesus does. There is a lot of talking. It also comprises what is known as the Little Commission, as opposed to the other better known Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. It is a chapter with strong Jewish influences in the language and the style. And it is a chapter that does not fit particularly well with the rest of Matthew. If you read Matthew all in one go, you will see how this chapter stands out a little bit from the rest. Which brings me to discuss the next point, which is where did the content of the canonical Gospels originated from? So I'm going to introduce the next concept, which is the so-called two-source hypothesis, or the Q hypothesis. So as you can see in this image, we have the three synoptic Gospels plus a fourth source, which is called the Q. The name Q comes from the German word Quelle, which means source, and it is the name that German philologists introduced during the 19th century to explain this hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, both Gospels of Matthew and Luke consist of contents which are taken from Mark, which as you may know historically has been proven to be prior to the writing of both Matthew and Luke. Some own content, which in the case of Matthew is represented by the light green color, and some content which is common to both Matthew and Luke but does not come from Mark. This content is labeled as Q. And the hypothesis goes that this content comes from a source, which is called Q, which is no longer available to us, and comes from the very earliest years of Christian tradition. Now, the characteristic of Q contents is that Q contents are sayings. So the Q hypothesis means that the sayings of Jesus, which are so common in Matthew and Luke, but are so scarce in Mark, come from another source, which is now lost and is called Q. And this is where the Gospel of Thomas comes in, because the Gospel of Thomas is entirely made of sayings. There is no actions, but only sayings. It has been hypothesized that the Gospel of Thomas comes straight from the Q source, and that some sayings from Q have ended up in Matthew and Luke, some sayings have ended up only in Thomas, and some sayings are common to all three Gospels, like I showed today, the common saying between Thomas and Matthew. So the importance of the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, which is peculiarity of being constituted only of sayings, has been a very important step forward in the Q hypothesis because it corroborates it. It corroborates the existence of a previous source called Q, which is only made of sayings. So today I have introduced to you the Gospel of Thomas. It's written in Coptic, but we know that the original version, which is now lost, was in ancient Greek. It was discovered just recently, but studying it and noticing the similarities and the differences between Thomas and, for example, Matthew, we can conclude that there is a strong argument for the existence of a source which scholars call Q, which is prior to the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. I hope that this brief introduction has awakened your interest in the Coptic language, as well as the ancient Greek versions of the Gospels, because studying the New Testament and the Apocryphal Gospels in their original language is a very interesting exercise which brings us closer, at least 16 centuries closer, to the origins of the Gospels. Today, the only existing copy of the Gospel of Thomas can be admired at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, Egypt, or can be viewed online in this very good quality facsimile. Thank you for listening to Read Ancient Languages. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook and Instagram for updates.